Welcome back to Notre Dame, Jack. It's been quite a journey for you since leaving here in 2016 at your graduation. Can you tell us more about a little bit your undergraduate background, again, just for purposes of kind of setting where you were at that point in time in your life, what you were thinking about as you kind of came out of undergraduate education, and ultimately what sort of led you to think about Esteem?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, David, for having me. Really excited to be back on campus. And for me, when I was in undergrad, I was primarily focused on engineering, biomedical engineering. I was always a healthcare guy. I guess gone even before that, my interest was always around healthcare. And during the course of undergrad, aside from academic work, I did do a lot around societies and sort of extracurriculars in the University of Galway, primarily around international development. Actually, I spent some time in Nepal and Tanzania doing some mostly healthcare related advocacy or development work in that capacity. When I was finishing up undergraduate, I was really struggling with this. Do I want to do something in business, which maybe I felt a draw towards, or more international development work actually, and then leaned into the business. And that's been sort of my career since.
Absolutely. What a career it's been. Mm-hmm. What are some of your, now when you got to Esteem, Jack, tell us a little bit about the application process for you. You found out about it, you applied, you obviously got in, and then a big decision for you. You know, you come across and do this kind of relatively new program back then, and just some of your thoughts back at that time.
Yeah. So I actually got introduced to the program through a guy called Anthony O'Sullivan, who I played Gaelic football with in Chicago for a summer. And when I read about it, it really felt like the optimal, like exactly the kind of thing that I was interested in. I was sort of entrepreneurial by nature. It took the training that I got from Galway and applied it in a real world sense. It was about a lot about impact. And it was a lot of the things I was really interested in. So when I got the opportunity, I remember you called me very clearly. I was thrilled to try and find a way to make it happen. And yeah, I had also competing job offers in Ireland, but the opportunity to come to the US as well was a big draw, and to get exposure to the scale and the sort of the whole Notre Dame ecosystem made it kind of an easier decision at the end of the day.
When you were here, some of the, I don't know, maybe key moments of learning and so forth, Jack, but you know, a lot of Esteem is sort of getting folks out of their comfort zone a little bit, especially people coming from a lot of the STEM disciplines.
Yeah.
Tell us about maybe a time or two where you felt like, wow, I'm being really challenged here, kind of forced in a good way, or the best of ways, to get out of that comfort zone and kind of, you know, think about a new way to look at problems and how you might solve them.
Yeah, that was definitely the kind of culture shock, I guess, from coming from an engineering background. One of the first classes we had, I think it was during the summer, I remember they were the motto of the class, or the mantra, was get out of the building, and having to go and do a lot of customer research and actually talk to people about potential business ideas. And it's just such a different way of learning than maths or very sort of technical discipline. To actually go out and converse and pressure test whether an idea is going to, you know, stand up to its merit when it meets the real world, I think is that was kind of the first thing. And then the whole capstone thesis, having a broader, real full business plan you have to develop and think through and really finalize and refine. That was a really different way of learning, but very valuable for what I did subsequent, I think, in the industry thereafter.
In that capstone experience, can you speak a little bit about the client that you were working with, and maybe just sort of what the overarching problem was that you guys were trying to figure out and solve?
Yeah, well, I guess it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning around my two interest areas. Coming out of undergrad, you were very amenable to trying to find something that fit those, and one of them was sort of international development angle, and the other was healthcare, and that's where my research had been. So what I ended up doing was working with a company called Diona, which is a software company out of Ireland who provided social services software and healthcare related software to enable people to get access to the healthcare system more efficiently. And basically what I was tasked with doing was assessing the utility of this technology in a East African context and trying to see if there was ways to apply these new software innovations to make healthcare access more available and more efficient for people working in rural East Africa. So I spent a lot of time calling up people in Libya and Tanzania and Ethiopia and asking them about sort of the work infrastructure there and trying to figure out whether this could fit into their work stream. And I think it really laid the foundation for, they ended up setting up through even Marie Costello, who did a lot more of the heavy lifting than me, I guess, but they set up some operations in East Africa subsequently. So it was a very real world, tangible sort of project to be a part of, and very aligned to my own personal interests, which is great.
I remember, yeah. So graduated from Esteem, went down a professional track, I know, which involved some consulting work. Jack, talk a little bit about the journey before the founding of Vocal Bio, which came, of course, in 2019.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for the audience, I think one of the things you're challenged with as you go through Esteem is like, what next? You know, there's all this sort of pressure for, is it a startup the right move, or is it sort of a bigger company, or is it something more professional services? There's a lot of opportunities coming out of Esteem as a result. I ended up going into a very early stage consulting practice. It wasn't one of the bigger shops, but it was a great sort of learning ground for someone who wanted to get exposure to a larger company environment, but also sort of feel like they're building something at the same time. So it's one of the early employees in a consulting firm called Dablink. And again, I was fortunate in that a lot of the work I got to do as a part of Dablink was working in healthcare, both on healthcare technology as well as actually in the life sciences. But over working for a few clients, I got increasingly excited about the profound impact medicines can have, particularly advanced medicines. There was a lot of gene therapy work I was doing with Dablink. So that kind of got me hooked, and that was ultimately what led to sort of moving into Open Bio.
Yeah. I'd love to hear sort of the founder's story.
Yeah.
What was leading up to it, how you got there. I know there was a really interesting program you were going through where you met your co-founder and how it actually got launched, and what was the sort of underlying passion and really sort of, momentum that you felt like it's time to make a move, it's time to do it now. And, you were in probably your mid to late 20s at that stage. So tell us a little bit about that story.
Still
and how
pretty
it came to be.
Probably too naive to realize how difficult it was going to be, and maybe that helped me in a way, I don't know. Definitely made it more difficult in some respects. But so I was in the US at that point about 6 years, I think, all in, because I spent some time in Purdue before Notre Dame. And I was starting to get a bit of an American accent, which was making me nervous. So I thought I need to get back closer to home, and I wanted to get back closer to Ireland. And I also had this sort of entrepreneurial energy that I wanted to try and apply. I felt like I had a bit of a taste for what it can look like. And through consulting, one of the companies I worked with scaled up very quickly, so I'd seen a bit of the growth trajectory for small businesses. And then, as I said, I went to do this program in London called Entrepreneur First, where they bring sort of amalgamation of very deeply technical people, very strong industry people, and then what they called catalysts, the people who are kind of in between. They got a bit of experience, a bit of technology, kind of maybe can make something happen. So I was in that third camp. And I ended up, through that process, meeting a scientific co-founder who'd spent a long time in liver research, mostly in an academic setting, but also in industry. And he had a very interesting idea around how to do human-centric drug discovery in liver disease. So a lot of times, to date, drug discovery relies on animal testing, which plays a key role, but liver disease is a bit more complicated and more of a chronic, sort of very human-like disease. So we thought about how could we do this with a more human lens, and that was sort of the initial founding sort of question we began to tease apart, and then ultimately build into a much larger drug discovery and development company over the years since.
Well, let's talk about sort of coming in at a very, very early stage, Jack, and then ending up in the CEO role, ending up in sort of, financing, capitalizing the company, putting a team together, which grew, it seems to me, very, very quickly. Maybe talk a little bit about some of those dynamics. Like, how did you become CEO? How did you jump into that seat and begin to put an amazing team together? Again, only in your late 20s.
Yeah.
And were there any lessons learned along the way from Esteem that may have helped prepare you for that, even if it wasn't apparent at first, but sort of as you reflect back on it, thinking, Esteem really helped get me kind of ready to handle the ambiguity, handle the craziness and the confusion that can come sometimes in those early days.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess go back to your first point. When we were first getting started, the accelerator program kind of gave some coaching around sort of shaping the dynamics of the founding team. And I was actually a bit reticent to take on a CEO title when I felt very unprepared for it. But there was a little bit of like a push to take on that role and sort of grow into it. And I felt over the years, I kind of got a bit more, you learn a lot in that capacity as an early stage company. Especially one that's growing, you're kind of forced into rapidly absorbing information and learning as you go. But in terms of team building, capital raising, I think a lot of it was the actual Esteem and US network that I built from having been here for a few years prior was a bit of a differential in Europe, because I think Europe has a lot of really rich science and really rich academic capabilities, but sometimes it struggles with the sort of entrepreneurial energy and the speed of work and the kind of ambition that's required to build a big company. I think I got a lot of that sort of exposure through both the Esteem program as well as some of the professional experience in the US. So we ended up being a good pairing in that my partner was very robust academic background, but hadn't got the sort of capital raising experience. So anyway, we took the science and moved it to California and sort of hit the ground running over there, where they're a bit more The kind of entrepreneur, young founders wasn't as much of an issue in the West Coast as it might have been in Boston or otherwise, and managed to get some big investors interested in this idea of trying to do human data-centric drug discovery, focus on liver disease, and then the team. I think as a young entrepreneur, a young CEO, or maybe it's particularly important to have like a lot of humility and kind of understand what you don't know as well as what you may be good at, because I think that's the only way you can attract really high quality people. Because I think sometimes young entrepreneurs come out kind of with a bit more of a chest beating energy or really a lot of brash to try and make up for the lack of experience. I think that actually scares people away and people don't want to work. So I think having a bit more humility and kind of recognizing what you don't know and being able to ask the right questions and try and recognize where your shortcomings are so that you can fill those gaps with the right people was a huge. And again, I think Esteem's sort of mantra around people first, impact centric. Those things also are important as a way to attract great talent into an organization.
So tell me, again, maybe for our audience too.
Yeah.
Company founded in 2019.
Yep.
Today's obviously late 2024, 5 years. Maybe give us a sense of size, scale, perspective on this, Jack. How big is the team now? And maybe even to sort of it's an incredible group of people you put together in terms of their talent and their intelligence, their academic records, their industry experience and so forth. As well as you've been involved with capitalizing the company.
Yeah.
So, how much money you've raised, some of the strategic deals that you were able to put together with some very large organizations, right? So just to, again, frame it up in terms of what's been accomplished in 5 years under your leadership, I'd love to just maybe put some of those metrics out.
Yeah. So over the last 5 years, we've scaled up about 50, 60 people now across 3 sites in Oxford, New York, and Taipei. We've raised about 120 million, give or take, in private and partnered financing through the 2 deals with GSK and Boehringer Ingelheim. And the company's got a very reputable board and a management team in place. So it's really set up for the next phases of its development now as it heads towards clinical trials. I think biotechs tend to follow this sort of discovery journey, and then as they get closer to a program, the next phase of clinical development takes over, and then ultimately 5, 6 years down the road, commercial stage. It's a slower product development cycle than in other industries. Company's been in a great place.
Well, speaking of that development over 5 years, and you talk about now this next stage, getting closer to clinical trials and so forth. So you recently made a really big decision, both personally and professionally, to say, I'm going to step away from Ochre Bio as the CEO. I'm going to leave the company. You've hired a new CEO to come in and take it to the next level. Tell us a little bit about that decision, Jack, in terms of, you mentioned humility before, and is there a good time to leave? What were some of the things going through your mind in terms of saying what's best for the company and getting it on the track, and then also what's best for you and how those lines crossed over to where you've kind of walked away now from Ochre?
Yeah, I think I might have mentioned it in the past, but I've always had a keen interest in neurodegenerative disease. It was sort of an area of interest, maybe not right after Esteem, but I tried to do a small company in that space before Ochre, and that was actually how I landed on entrepreneur. First, I had a sort of an idea around Alzheimer's palliative technology treatment approach. But since then, I felt the company was in a strong place. It's got 2 to 3 years runway on the back of 2 large pharma partnerships, and a good time to sort of think about what's next. And neurodegenerative disease has been an area of interest for me for a long time. And I think there's a lot you learn in those that first rodeo. You see things kind of come together, but they come together in maybe a little bit of a clunkier way. You're kind of building the blueprints for the plane, flying the plane, trying to sell the plane all at the same time. So this time around, the thinking is a bit sharper and more crystal in my mind around how do we get to value inflections faster? How do we think about a clearer pipeline strategy from the get-go? How do we get sort of the right team dynamics in place early on? And I think there's a lot I learned from Ochre that I'm hoping to take forward into the next one.
Yeah. Well, speaking of taking it to the next one, let's talk now about sort of where you go from here, because you were just sharing with me before we went on camera that there is something new and that you're excited about putting a new company together. Talk to us a little bit about that as much as you can, what in terms of information you feel comfortable you can disclose at this point, but about the company, the team, kind of where you see it going, obviously the space that it'll be in. And we'd love to learn what's the next leg of the journey look like.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I've been passionate about sort of neurodegenerative disease as an area of interest. I grew up around a lot of it, so I've sort of always been in the back of my mind that I'd like to try and do something in that space. I worked in RNA medicine at Ochre, and I'm kind of drank the Kool-Aid on RNA. It's a very elegant approach to drug discovery. It's highly specific in a way that sort of small molecule drugs aren't. And I think there's been a lot of breakthroughs around delivery science for neurodegenerative disease just in recent months that unlock the potential to use this approach to drug discovery and apply it in a neuro setting, and do so perhaps with a more focused pipeline strategy. We did a lot of discovery platform work at Okra, but this time around I'd really like to drive towards the clinic much faster, and have a clinical or initial patient group where I think there's a big unmet need whether we could service relatively quickly, and may take some technology out of universities this time to get going faster. So anyway, I didn't say a whole lot there, but it's coming together. The thinking is coming together. It's around Alzheimer's and potentially preventative interventions for Alzheimer's.
And you had mentioned that it may be sort of a Dublin-Boston type of connection.
Trying to build the ancestral relationship between Ireland and Boston. Boston is sort of the epicenter of capital, and a lot of research comes out of Boston. So trying to build between the two geographies, and sort of get the best of both worlds. Great science, access to capital, exposure or experience on both sides of the pond. So.
You know, Jack, earlier you mentioned this, you use the term network in terms of the ability for you to begin to network, and even the way that perhaps here in the US it's a little bit different than Europe in terms of the way people think about their networks, move with their networks, the speed and so forth. Obviously here with Esteem being part of the University of Notre Dame, you know, arguably one of the top networks maybe in the world. Loyal, a lot of depth, a lot of breadth, certainly an international brand and community that so many people recognize. Can you talk a little bit about how the network, specifically the Esteem/Notre Dame network, maybe played a role for you as a student here, even in terms of sort of where it led you to go and jumping into consulting initially, as well as professionally, you know, in terms of how has that network perhaps assisted you or helped you or helped accelerate things in terms of the development of Ochre, and how it may play into your next journey as well.
Yeah, maybe I can start with sort of 3 phases. The first one is even as a student. So when I first came to Notre Dame, I had spent most of my time in the west of Ireland to that point, and you know, it's an amazing place to grow up, an amazing place to study, but you don't get exposure to the same sort of corporate titans or a real sort of scale, the ambition of the folks that are associated with Notre Dame. So even being in Esteem, one of the things I took away as most impactful was getting to rub shoulders with the likes of Jack Brennan or some CEO of some large tech company, or these sort of very influential people in the business world that you wouldn't have met in Ireland. And then getting that exposure, even in slight little ways, kind of makes you think, wow, you know, they seem like quite normal people. Why, if they can do it, why can't I have a go at it as well? So I felt like that as a network was really powerful. And as you said, they're very generous networks. People will oftentimes make time. Subsequent to that, when I went into industry in the US, I got my job from a lunch at the local pub here with a Notre Dame alum who was setting up a new consulting firm and had a big vision and kind of sold me on it, and ended up spending 3 years in DC working with a really inspiring guy called Michael Wong, who's a longtime Notre Dame ally and advocate. So that was the network there. And then at Okra, our Series A fund lead investor came from a guy whose dad had been a priest at Notre Dame. Or not his dad, his dad had been a professor at Notre Dame, I should say. That would have been, anyways, but a scandal, sorry, bringing up some dust. But anyway, he was and we got to know each other from Notre Dame. So anyway, all that to say, each facet of my life, the Notre Dame exposure has been a really powerful force.
Yeah. When, if you were speaking today to a prospective student, whether they're in Ireland or the US or anywhere in the world, because it's truly very much of a global community here in the Esteem program, what would you say to them, Jack, as they're contemplating, gee, could that be me? Even listening to you here, thinking that same thing, like, hey, Jack seems pretty normal and funny and everything else. Could I see myself as an entrepreneur down the road, or an intrapreneur?
Yeah.
Or somebody maybe who is destined for a C-suite opportunity somewhere down the road. What would you say to them in terms of what they should be thinking about? Because if they're looking at this program, there's other programs, there's certainly other graduate school opportunities for them, job opportunities and so forth. But if you had to give any advice, or just basically say, hey, this is what really resonated with me with Esteem, and I wouldn't sort of be where I am today maybe without having taken that step. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that differentiate Notre Dame, but maybe one of the ones that stuck with me is this thesis around impact and thinking about how do you build businesses, how do you use capitalism as a force for good, but what is the end game that you're sort of striving towards? And that is I think in the world we live in today, that is a real differentiating feature. Aside from all of the things we talked about, the amazing network, the sort of exposure Esteem can offer, there's some time you spend in Silicon Valley, and the alumni of the program at this point as well. But I think that sort of focus on doing business with a focus on impact, I think, is a differentiator for the program.
Yeah. You mentioned alumni. We were just talking about if you start to work at sort of on both sides of the Atlantic, so to speak, back and forth with your new venture, that you just happen to just casually mention to me that, oh, I saw this person, this person from my class. So one of the things we also see in Esteem is that students get very, very close. They get very much an opportunity to work with everybody in the program, and those friendships and those relationships carry over for years. You've been out of Esteem for a number of years now, and still have those friendships, still are going to people's weddings and so forth and so forth. So any comment about just sort of the relationships that you develop in Esteem and why that's such an integral part of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is, because it's such a hands-on experience, Esteem really fosters deep connections and friendships. And I know a lot of my closest friends since the program, I are still Esteem alumni, even if they weren't in my class. Aside from the couple of wedding and dinner I recently did, I also went for a hiking trip with Esteem alumni from a variety of different years that I had no overlap directly with. So it's a really tight network, and they're all doing amazing and interesting things around the world. So it's a great group to be a part of.
As we wrap up, Jack, any last minute thoughts about what you might communicate to a prospective student or to somebody? And by the way, it doesn't have to be somebody necessarily just coming straight out of undergrad.
Yeah.
We have a number of those students, obviously, and we welcome them. But also it could be somebody maybe who's worked a couple of years and is thinking about, should I go back and get a master's degree or a graduate degree and so forth. So from either one of those two angles or perspectives, any thoughts, sort of final thoughts that you might want to share?
Yeah, well, maybe I'd say entrepreneurship sort of has this brand of the Mark Zuckerberg in California, but I think entrepreneurship is a variety of different things in different contexts. It's any sort of intention to take initiative in a setting to set something up that needs to be built for whatever reason but isn't being built, whether that's inside of a large company in a new product line or a new department, or if it is trying to start a business from scratch. They're all entrepreneurship in their own way. And I think if that is the type of personality or the type of work that you aspire to do, I think there's nowhere better to do it than in Esteem.
All right. Thank you, Jack. Always great to have you back.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully that hit the right notes.
That's right. And the sun is shining in South Bend.
The sun is shining, yes.